everyone, thank you. It's good to see so many people interested in learning more about being both an interpreter and potentially a translator. So my name is Hayden Toonan. I am 49 years old. Not quite 50, I always mention that at the beginning. I've been involved in languages from a young age. I first actually started, both of my parents come from Europe, they speak Dutch, but I started my formal training in a second language a little later, at the age of 18, and my second language is Japanese. So I've been involved in both study and in the industry for around 30 years, but as a professional translator and interpreter, 22 years. So first of all, a bit of terminology. Now you're really going to get the express train version of this. It's going to be a lot of information compressed into about 20 to 25 minutes. And if everyone's okay with that, if we're all happy, I'll just push forward. Just keep any questions you might have to the very end. First of all, you may ask yourself, well, why is he using this term professional or non-professional? I don't think I like the sound of that. What does it mean he's saying non-professional? So under the International Standards Organization terminology, a professional is someone who has a degree in languages, linguistics, translation and or interpreting, or a combination. A professional is someone who has undergone professional training, who works in the industry generally as an interpreter for more than 20 hours a week. They do ongoing professional development, and they also generally have at least 2 years experience. Alright, so what does a non-professional interpreter mean? Sometimes they're also referred to as community interpreters or citizen interpreters. Now it's just a term. Don't get too hung up about the wording itself. So non-professional means anyone who does interpreting in a community setting or otherwise. They may or may not have a degree, that is fine. They may or may not do professional development, also fine. They may only work 2 or 3 hours a month, and they provide a language support role. Okay. Right, now that we've got that out of the way, we're going to look at 3 sections. The first one is modes and methods of interpreting. Let's see if there's keywords. So the first question I have are, what are the 4 common methods or modes of interpreting? This is where the room goes awkwardly silent and no one wants to put their hand up. I'll give you the first one. Simultaneous interpreting. Okay, that's the easy one. So what is simultaneous interpreting? It's where the interpreter shadows the primary speaker by a few seconds, and it's their voice following quickly behind like that, in a simultaneous mode. Okay, what's another mode or method of interpreting? Yes, that is a language of interpreting, but it's not a mode or a method. What did you say? Yes, so what do we call that? Non-simultaneous. You have to go to the back of the classroom. It's called consecutive. Okay, so that means the primary person will speak, they will say a few sentences and then stop, and then you will interpret what they have said, and this is used in courtrooms and often in health interpreting situations. Okay, 2 more. Anyone want to guess? Okay. So the next one is whispering. Whispering interpreting is called shishitage, and essentially that is where you'll sit next to the person. Should I go one too far? You'll sit next to the person, and the primary will be speaking, and you they will get an answer, and you will whisper the interpretation into their ear. And this is actually a very stressful type of interpreting on your voice as an interpreter. So whispering shishitage. The last, most common type is what they call sight interpreting, which is visual interpreting. And this may be used quite a lot in healthcare situations. And this is where, for example, the clinician, the medical practitioner, the doctor, the nurse may show a physical report. It's written in English. You have to read it and then interpret what it says. That's sight interpreting. Okay? It's the same for a prescription, and it's a different style or mode of interpreting. Okay, terminology done. Look at that, already we're on section 2. Setting yourself up for success. So, what am I talking about? Talking about define your role. As an interpreter, what should you be doing? What should you not be doing? Okay. Before we get into the do's and don'ts, it's quite important for you to know what the boundaries are when you are an interpreter. Okay. So we have two, again a bit of terminology, two types: the conduit or the facilitator model versus a linguistic instrument model or the human tape recorder. Now, facilitator and a conduit, what that means is you are almost the primary speaker. You are engaging with that patient directly, and the clinician, the doctor, the nurse, they are there almost as a support role, providing the technical expertise. And in a medical setting or in a court setting, that's not you. Okay. We call it the human tape recorder style in a consecutive mode, is where 95% of the work that you'll be doing is the mode that you'll be following. Okay? So what does that actually mean? It means that you are the invisible voice. Sounds a little bit scary, isn't it? What that means again is you are there to provide a language service only. You're not there to be the doctor, you're not there to be the medical expert, you're there simply to translate language A into language B. That's it. Okay. It says, whenever possible, find out what kind of job or situation you will be interpreting. Is the discussion, can you have that discussion in advance, yes or no? And the more that you know about what is going on, the better you can prepare for it, both mentally and practically. So where possible, in the hospital, ask. It's not just the hospital, any job. If you know ahead of time what you're going to be talking about, you can get yourself ready. It's very important. Okay. So, under the same heading, the second point, you should also find out how that health professional wants you to engage with the patient. It may not just be the patient, it may be their family member, it may be other people in the room that are indirectly involved in that case. So know how they want you to engage. Do they expect you to work as part of the health team and facilitate discussion and support the patient and ask questions? Or do they expect you to work strictly as an interpreter within hospital guidelines as a language tape recorder only? Now you can see there's a huge difference in responsibility. One is holding their hand and saying, you're going to be okay. The other is, I'm invisible. Okay. When in doubt, be a human tape recorder. Right, section 3, do's and don'ts. Any questions or thoughts at this stage? Minister of New Zealand and the Prime Minister of Poland comes, and they are the main focus of the discussion, and it's being recorded, and it's going to go onto TV. So the last thing you want is the interpreter standing up and being the centre of attention. The goal of the interpreter is to relay the information, so they are sort of tucked in behind and quietly speaking in their second language. That's the role of whispering. Happens in courtrooms as well.
So it's almost like a simultaneous one, but you're not wearing headphones or anything like that.
Correct. Yeah. So it's usually when there's only one person who's receiving the interpretation. One or two. Yep. Okay. Good question. Any other questions? So we're happy with that? Right, here we go. The train is in full speed now. The do's and don'ts when interpreting. I think the first one is where you sit and stand. So again, generally the most accepted or standard seating position is the triangle. So it'll be 1, 2, 3. Let's say doctor, patient, interpreter. But there can be problems with this because doctor, patient, interpreter. The interpreter should not be the person who makes eye contact with the patient. So a very sharp triangle is better than a perfect triangle. Okay?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yep, so if I do a perfect triangle, and I have a doctor, a patient, and an interpreter, you want the patient to actually make eye contact with the doctor and speak to the doctor, and vice versa. And you are still invisible. Okay? The interpreter is a very non-glamorous job. Okay? But it's human nature for two people to speak the same language to make eye contact, get emotional, and have a face-to-face discussion. So if you narrow the triangle, the axes, so that I'm closer to the doctor, the nurse, clinician, then they have, and even a little bit behind them, and you can even instruct them, please talk to the doctor directly. Then that sort of forces them to make eye contact with the primary person. Okay. Number 2, always speak in a clear, monotone voice. Try to avoid emotion or getting happy or excited for a patient. For example, the doctor says, "Oh, you're having a baby girl, that's great!" You don't have to repeat it with the same enthusiasm in my second language. "Ah,そうですか! おならが生まれるんですか! 素晴らしいですね!" That's not your job. That's not how it's done. Okay? So you don't have to repeat it with the same enthusiasm because they can already hear it the first time. And it's very easy to start to become emotionally involved. You are a human tape recorder. You have no emotions. You are a machine. Okay? Number 3. Interpret in the first person tense. Context is key. So what is the first person tense? The patient says, the doctor asks, "So, how did you twist your ankle?" The patient says, "Well, my husband was out in the garden and I tripped over the hose when he was washing the car when I tried to run away from him." So you don't say, he said that he was in the garden and his husband, could be, was washing the car and he tripped over the hose and like this. That's second person. You talk as if you said it yourself. Always use first person. And at home, in front of the mirror, practice doing that. Because it's a skill. Context is key. So this person just said, "I tripped over the hose when I was running away from my husband." Now what does running away from my husband mean? Does it mean the husband was spraying her with the hose and they were having fun and she was running away? Or maybe she was they had a big fight and she was physically running away for her life. So context is key. And this ties into another point. Number 4. Never pretend you understand and interpret what you think is being said. Always stop and double check and ask for clarification. And if you can't think of the exact word, then it's okay to explain it. That's common sense, really, isn't it? The goal is never to pretend you're the doctor. You are a language support person. Let's see, we'll tie this in with something else later. So number 5, don't have side conversations with anyone other than the medical practitioner with discretion. So if we're in our triangle and the patient is saying something and you think, sounds like there's another issue, maybe there's a domestic violence issue involved, or there's a cultural issue. So you want to sort of have a conversation with the doctor to let them know what you think is going on in the background. There's a time and a place for that, so never do that in front of the person. Okay, it shows you do that with discretion. Anything that you say, they should be able to understand. Anything that the doctor says, they should be able to understand. Everyone in the room should know what is always going on all the time. Shouldn't be any secrets, if you know what I mean. And that becomes quite challenging when, let's say, there's a family member also in the room, and that's another can of worms, a big topic to cover as well. But essentially, if another person's in the room, let's say the doctor is informing the patient, you're pregnant, and the person in the room is a family member, and the family member goes, what, you're pregnant? And it's a big shock and surprise, and then they have a lot to say about that. So you have to understand the dynamic of who's in the room, what your role is, show discretion. Okay? It all ties it together. Okay, number 6. Don't try and show the patient how knowledgeable you are. Always maintain a humble, neutral position. Pregnancy. I interpret for pregnant people all the time. You're going to be fine. It's not your job. Okay? Number 7. The only time you should take off your interpreter hat is when you may need to explain something in private to the doctor. Now, that might be a cultural point, or like I said before, there's a family member in the room, there's a background issue, etc. If you need to speak with hospital staff privately, you find an appropriate way and time to do that. So that's about ethics. Number 8. Do not hand out or give out your personal information. Giving your name might be okay, but keep your information private, even if it might be culturally impolite. So often in small communities, everybody knows everybody. And that might be a challenge in its own right. But as a professional interpreter, when you're on the job, all they need to know is your name. Okay. 9. The best way to stop yourself from crying or getting emotional is to look at the floor. This is a good one. I see it in courtrooms, I see it in hospitals, I see it therapy and consultations. So keep looking at the floor and keep interpreting and keep your mind on the job. Because often in health interpreting there will be bad news. You can get emotionally involved very easily. So all you do is you just look at the floor and you try and block out the humanity aspect, focus on the language aspect. Okay. Number 10, keep in mind that every patient is different and every situation is different. But their emotional state and why they are in hospital is not your concern. So this comes back to you're not there to hold their hand or give them a hug. You are there to no feelings, but that is your job. And as I said, it's not a glamorous one. Okay, so at that point 10, do we have any questions? You may have been taught or trained something differently, and you may personally have a different approach to how you do language support, but these are what we would generally call the industry standard. Thoughts or questions?
What about if you know the person that you're interpreting? You know the person, how do you deal with that?
First and foremost, if there's a conflict of interest, you should not be there. That's where we come back to the very first slide about the role. Strictly speaking, if you are only an interpreter, you are a language technical, full stop. Okay? But that doesn't mean there are other dynamics or there are other roles that need to be incorporated as part of providing language support. And I fully understand that in what we call minority, rare language and emerging communities, there's 2 degrees of separation. You will know someone who knows someone. Everybody knows everyone. And if your role, if it's defined at the beginning, if your role is to be both a confidant, a support person, and you are there because they trust you and asked you to be there in that capacity, of course, then that's fine. So every situation is different. Hospitals in Australia, for example, want the interpreter to be part of the medical team. So you are basically, by extension, you are the therapist, you are the medical practitioner, you are the receptionist, you are the administrator, and you put on all of those hats while interpreting. And it's a full-on job, it's a big responsibility. But every hospital is different. The same that every judge in every courtroom is different, and how they run their courtroom is up to them. So you can say, no, hang on judge, I'm an interpreter, I have to follow these guidelines and ethics. Well, the judge will just say, well, okay, you can just stand outside and I'll carry on without you. And that's the end of it. So yes, it is a case by case, but my advice is that you understand the scope of your role from the very beginning, and you ask the questions that need to be asked. Okay, so we'll look at some takeaway points. How am I going for time?
We got quite a lot, so it's great. Yeah, I think as long as you want.
Oh. I've got 1 slide left, so 1 or 2. So the takeaway points are this. One of the secrets of improving and keeping up your skills as an interpreter is lifelong learning. Okay? You have to be serious about the responsibility, expanding your vocabulary and your language and subject matter knowledge. Research has shown that the best interpreters are those who actually understand the subject matter and the problem more than the technical language. Second takeaway. In a health interpreting situation, there are so many technical terms. I'm not a doctor. Are you a doctor? Maybe some of you are. So there are many private and confidential discussions that you interpret. There are emotional situations, good news, bad news, life and death, and so on and so on. There's also mountains of compliance. So the more you as an interpreter can understand the subject matter and the context, the better you can do your job. Okay, so there's a huge responsibility about not making mistakes. I'm not sure what the next slide is. Oh, look at that. How did that get there? together and they go, okay, let's party.
No, if there's an injury, then basically the layers of skin are interrupted, and it develops a kind of a collection of blood under the skin.
Okay, so
I'm a
what's
nurse.
so for the simple people in the room, what's another way of saying a hematoma? It's a bruise. Okay? So if you go, oh, you've got a big bruise on your leg, people will go, oh, okay. Oh, you've got a big hematoma on the back. You go, what? Am I going to die? See the difference? Right. Okay. So,
I also have a question. At times, like, although the heart smoking service by themselves, but at times, is a leprosy patient.
yes. Is the question, should you be filling in forms for people and sight interpreting, or is the question more around terminology that you don't understand? How do you get help?
Can you answer
I just made a big hole and I tried to do it. So,
Two holes actually.
so again, in that situation, it sounds like that you are not just an interpreter but a support person, and in the profession we are well aware that different languages and countries and people have a literacy limitation. So again, if you have been given permission and you are part of your role is to fill in forms for people, especially consent forms, and they sign at the bottom or there's more information they have to provide, as long as, my advice is you make it clear at the beginning that everyone is involved. So if there's a doctor there, you let the doctor know, I've been asked to fill in this form, ask for their private information and explain it as I go. So there's no nasty surprises. That sets out your scope of what you're meant to be doing, and everybody's happy. If you strike a word like hematoma, and or do you have a history of diabetes, then you ask. That's what that person is there for. The medical professional is to provide that knowledge. Be careful with things like diabetes, because you've got diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2, they're different things. So don't just think, oh, diabetes, I know that word, I don't need to ask. You should always err on the side of caution. So terminology, you're not the expert, get help.
Also challenging, strikes me, when someone gives you a long answer in a language and you kind of you've got to wait for them to finish where it goes in a way.
Well, you can just cut them off like I did.
Right, you could. But yeah, so
Consecutive, if you're dealing with a patient and they are telling their life story, your role may be to provide support beyond just language support. So you can then, like a nurse might step in and say, just stop there, so I can interpret. People get it. Going back to the example before, in the garden with the hose, that's actually a very complex sentence, especially when you have to change it into first person. If you think about it, I tripped over the garden hose when my husband was washing his parents' car in our driveway when I was running away from him. There's sort of 5 clauses in that sentence, and it's really easy to get it all muddled. So you don't have to speak slowly like a robot and help them to understand, but keeping information short and clauses to a minimum is probably the best way to get out information. Everybody has a habit of, I'm really busy and I've got 5 more appointments today, and okay, so this is what's happened, blah, 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 blah.